When an ISIS jihadi renounces Islam and calls the Quran a book of fables, you should listen. Robert Cerantonio was born in Australia in 1985. His family was nominally Catholic, but Cerantonio converted to Islam when he was 17 years old. He changed his name to Musa and became the president of the Islamic Society at Victoria University. Naturally, he was soon being paraded around the world for being a Western convert to Islam.
And subhanAllah, he had a massive library of books, and I began to read through one which was about the miracles of the Quran. And as soon as I had started reading this, I was glued. I could not stop reading it. And by the time I had finished, what I knew about Islam was the halal, the haram, this and that, the stories of the prophets. But reading about this was showing, Allah is saying, this book that I have could be from nobody but Allah. And as soon as I had finished reading it, Alhamdulillah, I said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulullah.
When someone's disobedient to Allah, for example, they're not eating halal food, or maybe they're not even praying or they're sinning, could this be one of the reasons why their du'as might not be accepted?
Cerantonio is one of those guys who learns languages quickly, so he became popular as a translator. He was hired to present shows for the Iqra TV network, but he was eventually fired for being too radical. I wonder where he got his radical ideas. One of life's great mysteries. At the time of his arrest for an ISIS plot to travel to the southern Philippines, overthrow the provincial government, and establish Sharia, Cerantonio was one of the most influential jihadi preachers in the world. Now he's an atheist, and it doesn't look like he's putting on a show because he's convincing other Muslims to leave Islam by exposing errors in the Quran in prison. There are a lot of things we could discuss about Cerantonio, but here I just want to take a quick look at one of the problems that started bothering him about the Quran. This is from an article titled, Why an ISIS Propagandist Abandoned Islam, from The Atlantic. The link is in the description box. We'll pick up the story after Cerantonio's conviction. In prison, he began to study the Quran in greater detail and focused on the aspects that most puzzled him. Among these was the figure called Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one, who appears in the Quran's 18th chapter and is believed by many to refer to Alexander the Great. Cerantonio did not see a resemblance between Dhul Qarnayn and the Alexander of history, but he noted similarities between Dhul Qarnayn and a heavily fabulized version of Alexander's story written in Aramaic. He considered that the Aramaic version may have plagiarized the Quran, but after acquiring a copy of the Aramaic and translating it for himself, he determined that the reverse was more likely. I always knew that being proficient in Aramaic would one day prove useful. If you ask Muslims today about Dhul Qarnayn, they'll usually insist that it's not Alexander the Great. They say this because Dhul Qarnayn, according to the Quran, was a devout Muslim, while Alexander the Great was as pagan as you can possibly be. So, to get around an obvious Quran blunder, Muslims claim that Dhul Qarnayn is actually someone else, not Alexander. But this response only works if you're not at all familiar with the legends about Alexander that were circulating in the Middle East during the 7th century. Except for the part about being a Muslim, Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran sounds exactly like Alexander the Great in the popular legends of the 7th century, and he doesn't sound like anyone else ever. So when Muslims tell us that Dhul Qarnayn isn't supposed to be Alexander, they're just denying the obvious. Imagine if Muhammad were delivering revelations today in our time. He comes out and says, "I just received a revelation from Allah. It's a revelation about the man of the red coat. The red-coated one hath a white beard, and lo, he is jolly, and lo, he is a Muslim. He saith unto the elves that maketh the toys, Behold, Christmas is nigh. Finish the toys so I can climb into my sleigh and deliver them to the children around the world. I know if they've been naughty or nice. Bring me Rudolph, ho, ho, ho." Anyone hearing that would immediately think, hey, wait a minute. That's Santa Claus. The story of Santa Claus was originally based on a real person, but now it's just a bunch of silly stories. The real person wasn't a Muslim, he was a Christian bishop. This can't be a revelation from God. But as soon as you point out the mistake, the response from Muhammad's followers would be, no, the revelation isn't about Santa Claus, it's about someone else. Okay, who? Who's it about then? Who else fits that description? Same thing with Dhul Qarnayn. Realizing that Dhul Qarnayn was not at all a real person, but was rather based on a fictional account of Alexander the Great, instantly left me with only one possible conclusion. The Quran was not divinely inspired, he wrote. It had taken Alexander the Great fan fiction as fact. Of course, I would have preferred to discover all that 17 years ago and avoided much trouble. He has therefore abandoned not only ISIS, but Islam and religion as a whole. He is an atheist and admires the God Delusion author Richard Dawkins. Notice, because Cerantonio could read the Alexander legends for himself, he knew that modern Muslim responses to the problem were false. Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran is supposed to be Alexander the Great. But not only is Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran a Muslim, when Alexander most certainly wasn't, the stories about Dhul Qarnayn aren't taken from the actual history of Alexander the Great, they're taken from 7th century fan fiction. Muhammad took popular stories about a popular figure and turned the popular figure into a Muslim for his new religion. It's the same thing Muhammad did with Jesus and with so many others. This basic information about the Quran is enough to destroy the faith of an ISIS jihadi. And that's why Muslim sheikhs and imams lie about it. The average Muslim who says that Dhul Qarnayn wasn't supposed to be Alexander the Great isn't intentionally lying to you. He's just repeating what his sheikhs and imams told him to say. But his sheikhs and imams know who Dhul Qarnayn is supposed to be. So they lie about it to protect their followers from doubts. Can you imagine what would happen if basic information like this were common knowledge? What if, instead of Western journalists and educators constantly shielding Islam from criticism, they instead shared this basic information about the Quran until everyone recognized Muhammad as a really bad plagiarist? Yeah, some feelings might get hurt along the way, but wouldn't it be worth it to finally put an end to 14 centuries of jihad?
It just backfired on you. It just backfired on you. This is a part of a religion. There's a reason to it. Yeah?